The merciless sun beat down on the Llano Estacado, that vast stretch of featureless plain where Texas met New Mexico territory. Heat waves shimmered across the parched landscape, distorting the horizon into a wavering mirage of false hope. At the center of this desolation, a man's head protruded from the baked earth like some grotesque desert flower. His face, weathered by 45 years of frontier life, was now further ravaged by 2 days of direct exposure to the punishing southwestern sun. Cracked lips, blistered skin, and eyes swollen nearly shut from sunburn gave Mason Blackwood the appearance of a man already more dead than alive. Only the occasional rasping breath and the persistent twitch beneath his left eye suggested otherwise. Mason had been a Texas Ranger, then a scout for the Army, and more recently a rancher trying to carve out a modest existence in contested territory. Now he was simply a man waiting to die, buried up to his neck by the Comanche war party that had ambushed him while he tracked rustled cattle from his small spread near Fort Griffin. The Comanche had a particular hatred for men like Mason, who had once guided Army patrols through their hunting grounds. They considered such men worse than ordinary soldiers. They were betrayers of the land itself, showing the bluecoats how to navigate territories that should have remained mysteries to white men. Death by exposure was a punishment they reserved for special enemies, a slow torment that allowed a man to reflect on his transgressions as his body gradually surrendered to thirst, heat, and eventually the scavengers that would peck at his exposed flesh while he still lived. Mason had seen the aftermath of such deaths before, bleached skulls grinning up from the earth, the rest of the body still buried below. He'd always considered it among the worst ways to die. Now, experiencing it firsthand, he knew his imagination had failed to capture the true horror. The physical pain was excruciating, but the psychological torment was worse. The absolute helplessness, the maddening itch that couldn't be scratched, the slow deterioration of a mind trapped in a body that could not move. At night, when the desert cooled, he shivered uncontrollably, his teeth chattering so violently he feared they might crack. During the day, the sun turned his exposed head into an oven, cooking his brain until delusions crept in around the edges of his consciousness. Through cracked and bleeding lips, Mason whispered prayers he hadn't uttered since childhood, back in Tennessee, before the war. He wasn't sure if he was seeking divine intervention or simply filling the terrible silence with something other than the distant howl of coyotes. They would come for him soon enough, those prairie wolves, when they sensed he was too weak to shout or spit at them. Perhaps that would be a mercy, quicker than the alternative. A lone vulture circled lazily overhead, a black spot against the relentless blue. Scout for the others. Mason thought dimly, just waiting for me to stop moving. As consciousness began to slip away again, his mind wandered to his wife Sarah, 6 years dead from fever, and their son William, grown now and working for the railroad back east. Neither knew where he was. No one did. Mason had told his nearest neighbor he'd be gone 3 days at most, tracking the rustlers. That had been 4 days ago. Or was it 5? Time had become fluid. Markers like sunrise and sunset, merely transitions between different forms of torment. He wondered if anyone would even find what remained of him, or if his bones would simply become another mystery of the desert, his disappearance another tale told around campfires. The hallucinations had started sometime during the 2nd day. At first, they were simple mirages, lakes of cool water that disappeared as quickly as they formed in his mind. Then came the conversations with Sarah, so vivid he could almost feel her hand on his brow. By the 3rd day, reality had frayed completely at the edges. When the sound of hoofbeats reached his ears late in the afternoon, Mason was certain it was just another trick of his failing mind. He'd imagined rescue too many times already. The riders would appear on the horizon, then dissolve into heat waves and disappointment. But these hoofbeats persisted, growing louder rather than fading away. With tremendous effort, Mason forced his swollen eyes to open wider. Squinting against the glare, A small party of mounted Comanche materialized from the heat haze, 5 or 6 warriors and one other figure, smaller, less distinctly outlined against the harsh light. They approached cautiously, as if half expecting a trap, though what threat a man buried to his neck could pose was beyond Mason's comprehension. As they drew nearer, he could make out their features more clearly. The warriors were painted for war, their expressions impassive as they regarded what remained of the white man they had left to die. The smaller figure hanging back from the main group gradually came into focus as Mason's eyes adjusted. A young woman, perhaps 20 years of age, sat astride a painted pony. Her straight black hair was adorned with a single eagle feather, and she wore a dress of soft deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork. Even in his delirious state, Mason recognized the significance of her attire and posture. This was no ordinary Comanche woman. She was the daughter of someone important, perhaps even the chief himself. The warriors formed a loose semicircle around Mason, their horses stomping restlessly in the dust. One of them, a tall man with 3 horizontal stripes of red paint across his cheekbones, dismounted and approached. In his hand was a water skin, which he uncorked and held tantalizingly close to Mason's parched lips. "You live longer than most, Ranger," the warrior said in surprisingly good English. 2 days, we thought. Maybe 3, not 4. Mason tried to respond, but his tongue, swollen and dry as old leather, refused to form words. All that emerged was a ragged croak. The warrior smiled without warmth and pulled the water skin away before Mason could drink. "Chief Mountain Bear asks if you are ready to enter the spirit world, or if you wish to beg for mercy first." Behind the circle of warriors, the young woman shifted uncomfortably on her mount. Her dark eyes, filled with something that might have been pity, met Mason's briefly, before darting away. The warrior with the water skin noticed this exchange and frowned slightly before turning his attention back to the buried man. "Little Fawn should not be here," he muttered, more to himself than to Mason. "Women have no place in warrior business." But the chief's daughter remained where she was, her presence a silent challenge to the established order. Mason summoned what little moisture remained in his mouth and managed to whisper hoarsely, "Water, please." The warrior's expression hardened. He upended the water skin, allowing a thin stream to fall just inches from Mason's face, close enough for him to smell the life-giving liquid, but not to taste it. The cruel mockery elicited laughter from the other warriors. But Little Fawn's face remained solemn, her eyes now fixed on the horizon as if she could not bear to watch. The tall warrior remounted his horse and addressed Mason one final time. "We return tomorrow. If coyotes have not taken your eyes by then, perhaps Mountain Bear will grant you the mercy of a knife." As suddenly as they had appeared, the Comanche were gone, leaving only swirling dust and the memory of water spilled tantalizingly close. Mason slipped in and out of consciousness as the afternoon wore on, his thoughts increasingly incoherent. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in bloody hues of crimson and gold. With darkness would come the bone-deep chill of the desert night, and with it, the coyotes growing ever bolder. Mason wasn't sure he would survive until morning, wasn't sure he wanted to. Death had ceased to be something to fight against, and had become instead a release to be embraced. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, he closed his eyes and tried to imagine himself elsewhere. Back in Tennessee, perhaps, fishing in the clear streams of his youth, or in his small cabin near Fort Griffin, with a fire crackling in the hearth and coffee bubbling in the pot. Reality intruded in the form of a soft sound nearby, not the padding of coyote paws that he'd been dreading, but the deliberate tread of a moccasined foot on sandy soil. Mason forced his eyes open, struggling to make out shapes in the gathering darkness. A slender figure knelt beside him, the faint scent of wildflowers cutting through his delirium. "Be still," whispered a female voice in accented English. "I help you." Little Fawn, the chief's daughter, had returned alone. In her hands, she held a wooden bowl of water and what appeared to be some kind of digging implement fashioned from bone or antler. Gently, she lifted Mason's head as much as his buried position would allow and brought the bowl to his lips. He drank greedily, choking and sputtering as his body struggled to remember how to swallow. The water was warm and tasted of the skin bag it had been carried in, but to Mason, it was sweeter than any spring water he'd ever tasted. "Not too much," Little Fawn cautioned, pulling the bowl away. "First small drink, later more." She set the water aside and began to dig around his neck and shoulders, loosening the hard-packed earth with surprising efficiency. Mason wanted to ask why she was helping him, what had prompted this dangerous act of mercy, but his recently moistened tongue still refused to form coherent words. As if sensing his question, Little Fawn paused in her digging and said softly, "My mother was captive. White woman from place called Kentucky. Comanche raid took her when young. She became wife to my father, but never forgot her first people." Little Fawn resumed her digging with increased urgency, frequently glancing over her shoulder at the empty desert behind them. "My father, good man, but hard. Warrior ways, only ways he know." Her English, while accented, was remarkably good, suggesting her mother had taught her secretly over many years. "She die 2 winters past. Fever. Before she go to spirit world, she make me promise. If ever I can save innocent life, I must, for her sake." Mason's mind struggled to process this information through the fog of dehydration and exposure. A white captive become a chief's wife was not unheard of on the frontier, though such women rarely maintained any connection to their former lives. That this young woman's mother had not only remembered her origins, but had passed along both her language and some measure of her values to her daughter, was extraordinary. As Little Fawn continued to excavate around his shoulders, Mason gradually found his voice. "Your people. Find out. Kill you," he rasped. Little Fawn's hands stilled momentarily. "Perhaps," she acknowledged, her voice barely audible above the night sounds of the desert. "But mother say, sometimes right path is dangerous path." Working steadily through the night, Little Fawn managed to free Mason's shoulders and eventually his arms. Though the process was agonizingly slow, the earth had been packed tightly by the warriors, and in places it had baked to an almost concrete-like hardness under the desert sun. By moonrise, Mason was able to assist in his own excavation, his arms weak and tingling with returning circulation, but functional enough to scoop away the loosened soil. Neither of them spoke much during these hours of labor. Little Fawn was clearly terrified of discovery, and Mason lacked the strength for conversation. Periodically, she would stop her digging to give him small sips of water, never enough to satisfy his desperate thirst, but sufficient to keep him alive and increasingly lucid. As the moon reached its zenith, casting stark shadows across the desert floor, Little Fawn finally cleared enough earth to expose Mason's chest and waist. "Rest now," she whispered, sitting back on her heels. "Dawn comes soon. Must finish before light." Mason nodded weakly, flexing his fingers to encourage blood flow. "Why did they do this?" he asked, his voice still ragged but stronger than before. "What did I do to earn such a death?" Little Fawn looked away, her profile sharp against the moon-silvered landscape. 3 moons ago, Blue-coat soldiers attack our winter camp on Medicine Lodge Creek. Many die, women, children." Her voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the water skin. "My young brother among dead. Soldiers had scout. Man like you, with beard like fire." Mason closed his eyes, understanding washing over him like a cold wave. "A man with red hair and beard," he murmured. "They thought I was him." Little Fawn nodded. "My father's brother see you tracking. Think you are Firehair Scout. Bring warriors to capture." The case of mistaken identity might have been almost comical under different circumstances. Mason, with his dark hair and beard streaked with grey, bore little resemblance to the red-haired scout he'd occasionally encountered at Fort Griffin. But in the eyes of grieving, vengeful warriors, perhaps one white man looked much like another. "I'm sorry about your brother," Mason said quietly, "but I had no part in that attack. I've been ranching these past 3 years, haven't scouted for the army since '73. Little Fawn met his gaze steadily. "I know this now. My father would know too, if he looked with clear eyes, but grief clouds vision, makes men seek blood for blood." By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, Little Fawn had freed Mason completely from his earthen prison. His legs, numb and unresponsive after days of immobility, refused to support his weight. Little Fawn glanced anxiously at the brightening horizon. "Must go now," she urged. "My father's brother returns with sun, brings others." She helped Mason to a sitting position and pressed a small bundle wrapped in deerskin into his hands. Food, water, medicine for burns. Then she retrieved something that had been hidden nearby, a dun-colored Mustang, saddled and ready. "My mother's horse," she explained, "knows desert paths. Will carry you to trading post at Adobe Walls. 2 days' ride northeast." Mason stared at her in disbelief. The risk she was taking was enormous. If her people discovered her betrayal, her punishment would be severe, perhaps even fatal. "Come with me," he suggested impulsively. "Fort Griffin, safety there." Little Fawn shook her head firmly. "My place here, with my father, with my people." She helped Mason to stand, supporting his weight as he hobbled toward the waiting horse. "My mother have 2 worlds in her heart, always pain. I have one world, Comanche world, even when path is hard." With Little Fawn's assistance, Mason managed to mount the Mustang, though the effort left him lightheaded and nauseated. His body, abused by days of exposure and immobility, protested every movement. "Northeast," Little Fawn reminded him, pointing toward the distant horizon. 2 days. Waterholes marked by stone cairns, horse nose. She stepped back, her expression solemn in the growing light. Mason looked down at her, this young woman who had risked everything to save a stranger, based on a promise to her dying mother. Words seemed inadequate, but he tried anyway. "Why tell me about your mother, your brother? You could have freed me without explanation." Little Fawn's dark eyes met his, unwavering. "So you understand. So when bluecoats ask about Comanche, you remember we are people with hearts that break, not just enemies to kill." She placed her hand briefly on the horse's neck, then stepped away. "Go now, quickly." Mason gathered the reins in his raw, blistered hands. "I won't forget," he promised. "Your name, your real name, what is it?" For the first time, a hint of a smile touched her lips. "I am Tatami. It means spring rain. In English, they call me Little Fawn." As Mason urged the Mustang forward, he cast one final glance over his shoulder. Tatame still stood where he had left her, a solitary figure against the vast emptiness of the Llano Estacado. Then she turned and began walking swiftly in the opposite direction, back toward her people's camp. Mason faced forward, setting his course for the northeast and the promise of safety at Adobe Walls. His body was a catalogue of pain: sunburned skin, dehydrated tissues, muscles atrophied from days of immobility, but his mind was clearer than it had been since his capture. He had been granted a second chance at life through an act of extraordinary courage and compassion. Such a gift carried with it an obligation. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the desert in hues of amber and gold, Mason made a silent vow. He would remember Tatam's story, and he would share it with anyone who would listen, in a land where hatred between whites and Comanche ran bone-deep. Perhaps one tale of mercy might make a difference, might cause someone to see with clear eyes, as Tatame had put it, rather than through the fog of prejudice and fear. The journey to Adobe Walls tested Mason's endurance to its limits. Despite Little Fawn's, Tatame's, care in providing water and food, his weakened condition made each hour in the saddle an ordeal. The Mustang proved as reliable as she had promised, picking its way confidently across the featureless landscape, stopping occasionally at hidden waterholes marked by small piles of stones. By nightfall of the first day, Mason's fever had returned, and he slipped in and out of consciousness, staying mounted only because he lacked the strength to dismount. He made camp, if the simple act of sliding from the saddle and collapsing beside a small waterhole could be called making camp, as darkness fell. Using the flint and small knife Tatami had included in her bundle, he managed to start a modest fire, more for light and comfort than for warmth in the mild spring night. As he chewed slowly on the pemmican she had provided, Mason found his thoughts returning repeatedly to the young woman and the extraordinary choice she had made. To defy her father, the chief, and her uncle, a warrior of standing, required courage beyond measure. The Comanche were not known for their forgiveness of betrayal, even from the daughter of a chief. Would she be discovered? Mason tried to reconstruct the scene of his burial site in his mind. Had they left obvious signs of his rescue? Tatame had done her best to scatter the excavated earth, but in the clear light of day, experienced trackers would have little difficulty determining what had happened. His only hope, her only hope, was that they would assume he had somehow freed himself. An unlikely scenario given the thoroughness with which he had been buried, but perhaps just plausible enough to cast doubt on Tatami's involvement. As the fire burned down to embers, Mason wrapped himself in the small blanket from his saddlebag and gazed up at the star-filled sky. The same stars would be shining down on Tatami tonight, perhaps even now returning to her father's lodge with some plausible explanation for her absence. He whispered a prayer for her safety, the words carrying on the night breeze across the silent desert. Then, exhaustion claiming him, he fell into a fitful sleep plagued by dreams of pursuit and buried men crying out from the earth. Morning brought renewed determination. Mason's body still ached abominably, his skin blistered and peeling from sunburn, but the fever had broken sometime during the night, leaving his mind clearer. Adobe walls came into view late in the afternoon of the second day, a welcome sight on the barren horizon. The trading post, twice destroyed during conflicts with the Plains tribes and twice rebuilt, now consisted of 3 adobe buildings surrounded by a low wall of the same material. As Mason approached, he could make out figures moving about the compound, traders, a few hunters, perhaps some freight haulers waiting for the next shipment. His appearance caused an immediate stir. A man in his condition, alone on the prairie, clearly told a story of survival against odds. 2 men hurried out to meet him, catching him as he all but fell from the saddle. "Good Lord, mister, what happened to you?" one of them asked, supporting Mason's weight as they helped him toward the largest of the buildings. "Comanche," Mason managed to reply, his voice still raw. "Buried me, left me to die." The men exchanged glances over his head. "How in tarnation did you get away?" the second man asked. Mason hesitated only briefly before answering. "Dug myself out. After they left. Took most of a night." The lie came easily to his lips, protective instinct overriding his natural inclination toward honesty. Tatami's safety depended on her involvement remaining secret. Inside the trading post, Mason was lowered onto a rough wooden bench. The proprietor, a heavy-set man with an impressive walrus mustache, pressed a tin cup of whiskey into his hands. "Drink that down, friend, then we'll see about getting you fixed up." Mason complied gratefully, the liquor burning a trail of fire down his parched throat, but bringing with it a welcome warmth. As the whiskey took effect, he provided a carefully edited version of his ordeal. The ambush while tracking rustled cattle, the mistaken identity, the burial. In his telling, the Comanche had left him alone to die, and he had managed through desperate effort to free himself. The traders and hunters gathered around, listened with expressions ranging from horror to grudging admiration. "Lucky man," commented one grizzled hunter, chewing thoughtfully on a plug of tobacco. Ain't many that walk away from that kind of Comanche attention. Another man, wearing a badge that identified him as a local deputy, asked more pointed questions. Which band was it? You recognize any of them? We've had reports of Mountain Bear's people raising hell along the Canadian River. Mason feigned greater disorientation than he felt. Can't say for sure. Was pretty far gone by the time they finished burying me. For 3 days, Mason recuperated at adobe walls, regaining his strength and allowing his sunburned skin to begin healing. The proprietor, whose name was Hansen, proved a generous host, providing food and lodging in exchange for Mason's promise to repay him once he returned to his ranch. Ain't the first time I've extended credit to a man down on his luck, Hansen explained with a shrug. Won't be the last, neither. During his convalescence, Mason learned that tensions between settlers and the Comanche had escalated significantly in recent months. The attack on the winter camp at Medicine Lodge Creek that Tatami had mentioned was apparently part of a larger military campaign to force the remaining free bands onto reservations. Army's determined to finish it this time, the deputy told him over coffee on the morning of Mason's 3rd day at the trading post. Got orders to round up every last Comanche and Kiowa still roaming free, ship 'em all down to Fort Sill. Mason kept his expression carefully neutral. Seems to me there ought to be room enough for everybody, he remarked mildly. The deputy snorted. Tell that to the settlers with arrows in their backs. Or the women carried off. No, sir, only good solution is to get 'em all settled on reservations where they can be watched. On the 4th morning, Mason prepared to depart. His strength had largely returned, though his face and hands remained painfully sunburned, the skin peeling in large patches. Hansen provided him with supplies for the journey to Fort Griffin: jerky, hardtack, coffee, and a small bottle of whiskey for medicinal purposes. As Mason saddled Tatami's Mustang, which he had decided to keep rather than sell, Hansen approached with a concerned expression. You sure you're fit to travel, Blackwood? Could rest up another day or two? Mason shook his head. Appreciate the offer, but I need to get back to my place. See what's left of it. He didn't voice his deeper concern, that Tatami might have been discovered, that her act of mercy might have brought disaster upon her. There was little he could do if that were the case, but the not knowing gnawed at him. Besides, he added with a wry smile, I've got a story that needs telling. Hansen raised an eyebrow. About your escape? Already told it, haven't you? Mason swung into the saddle, adjusting his hat to shade his still tender face. Not all of it, he replied cryptically. Not the most important part. The journey to Fort Griffin took another 4 days, during which Mason encountered no sign of Comanche or any other travelers. The vast emptiness of the Texas plains, once a source of dread during his burial ordeal, now felt oddly comforting, a buffer between worlds, a place to think. By the time the fort came into view, its stone building standing stark against the horizon, Mason had reached a decision. He would tell the truth about his rescue, or at least a version of it that protected Tatam's identity while acknowledging the reality of what had happened. The story of a Comanche woman risking everything to save a white man needed to be told, especially now, with tensions between the cultures at a breaking point. It might not change much in the grand scheme of things, but if it caused even a few people to see with clear eyes, as Tatami had put it, rather than through the fog of prejudice, it would be worth whatever skepticism or ridicule he might face. Fort Griffin bustled with activity as Mason rode in, soldiers drilling in the parade ground, supply wagons being loaded, civilians going about their business in the small settlement that had grown up around the military post. He made his way directly to the office of the commanding officer, Colonel Randall Mackenzie, whom he had known during his scouting days. Mackenzie, a stern-faced man with a reputation for relentless pursuit of hostile Indians, received Mason with surprise and a rare display of emotion. Blackwood, good God, man, we thought you were dead. He ushered Mason into his Spartan office and poured 2 glasses of bourbon from a bottle kept in his desk drawer. Richards, that new rancher who bought the old Hankins place, rode in about a week ago. Said he'd found your horse wandering, saddle empty. Search party found signs of a Comanche ambush, but no body. Mason accepted the bourbon gratefully and gave Mackenzie an abbreviated account of his capture and burial. When he reached the part about his rescue, he hesitated only briefly before continuing. I'd be dead now, if not for the chief's daughter. She came back alone, dug me out, gave me her horse. Mackenzie's expression shifted from sympathy to skepticism. A Comanche woman rescued you? The chief's daughter, no less. Blackwood, I've known you for years as a truthful man, but that's difficult to believe. Mason met his gaze steadily. Nevertheless, it's what happened. She risked everything because her mother, a white captive who became the chief's wife, made her promise to save innocent lives when she could. Mackenzie leaned back in his chair, studying Mason's face as if searching for signs of delusion or falsehood. Finding neither, he sighed heavily. Which chief? Did she say? Mason nodded. Mountain Bear. Her name is Tatami, Little Fawn in English. At this, Mackenzie sat forward abruptly. Mountain Bear? You're certain? When Mason confirmed this, the colonel's expression grew grave. Mountain Bear's band was surrounded 3 days ago at Palo Duro Canyon. My men, along with Texas Rangers from Company D. A cold weight settled in Mason's stomach. What happened? He asked. Already dreading the answer, Mackenzie's eyes held a mixture of satisfaction and something that might have been regret. Most of the warriors were killed in the initial assault. The rest, along with the women and children, were captured. They're being escorted to Fort Sill as we speak. Mason set his glass down carefully, his hand suddenly unsteady. The women and children, they weren't harmed? Mackenzie shook his head. Standard procedure. They'll be registered at Fort Sill, assigned to lodges. The usual process. He hesitated, then added more quietly, there was one casualty among the women. The chief's daughter. Apparently she tried to break away during the march, ignored orders to halt. Sentry had no choice. The world seemed to tilt beneath Mason's feet. He gripped the edge of Mackenzie's desk to steady himself, the colonel's voice continuing as if from a great distance. Damn shame, young woman like that. But these people have to learn there are consequences for resistance. Mason barely heard him. In his mind's eye, he saw Tatami as she had been that night in the desert, determined, compassionate, defying her people's traditions to do what she believed was right. Had she been trying to escape the soldiers, or had her people discovered her role in Mason's rescue? Had her last thoughts been of the white captive mother who had taught her that sometimes the right path was the dangerous one? Mackenzie was still talking, something about Mason's ranch and compensation for losses, but the words washed over him without registering. I need to see her, Mason interrupted abruptly. The chief's daughter. Where was she buried? Mackenzie blinked in surprise. Why on earth would you want to? Mason cut him off with a sharp gesture. She saved my life. Colonel, the least I can do is pay my respects. 3 weeks later, Mason Blackwood stood before a simple wooden cross on a low rise overlooking Fort Sill. The marker bore no name, only the date and Comanche female Mountain Bear's band. Mason had brought with him a small bundle of wildflowers gathered from the prairie, similar to those Tatami had worn in her hair the night she freed him. He placed them at the base of the cross, then straightened slowly, his eyes on the distant horizon, where the sun was beginning to set. I've told your story, Tatame, he said quietly, to the colonel, to the newspaper man in Fort Griffin, to anyone who would listen. Some believe it, some don't, but the story's out there now, making its way. He paused, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. Your father is here at the fort. They wouldn't let me speak to him, but I left a message. Told him you died with honor, trying to help someone in need. Don't know if that will ease his grief, but it's the truth. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass around the gravesite. In the distance, the evening bugle call floated across the parade ground of the fort, signaling the end of another day. Mason remained by the grave until the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared. Finally, he replaced his hat and turned to go, but not before making one final promise. Your mother was right, Tatami. Sometimes the right path is the dangerous one. I won't forget that lesson, and I'll make sure others hear it too. As he walked back toward the fort, where he had arranged temporary lodging before beginning the long journey back to his ranch, Mason reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He had nearly died at the hands of the Comanche, only to be saved by one of their own. Now that savior lay in an unmarked grave while he lived on to tell her story. There was a responsibility in that, a debt that could never fully be repaid, but must nevertheless be honored. Perhaps, in some small way, Tatame's sacrifice might help bridge the vast divide between two peoples locked in a cycle of violence and retribution. It wasn't much, just one story of compassion amid countless tales of cruelty and vengeance, but it was something, a beginning, a seed planted in hard soil that might, with time and care, grow into understanding. In the years that followed, Mason Blackwood kept his promise. He rebuilt his small ranch near Fort Griffin, but he also became known throughout the region as a man who advocated for fair treatment of the Indians now confined to reservations. He spoke out against broken treaties and corrupt Indian agents, using his own experience as testament to the humanity that existed on both sides of the conflict. Some labeled him an Indian lover, a traitor to his race. Others, particularly among the growing numbers of settlers with no direct experience of the frontier wars, found his perspective enlightening. Occasionally, a newspaper would reprint the story of his rescue, usually embellished beyond recognition, but still containing the kernel of truth, that a Comanche chief's daughter had risked everything to save a white man's life. On the 5th anniversary of Tatam's death, Mason made the journey to Fort Sill once more. The wooden cross marking her grave had weathered considerably. The inscription barely legible. Mason replaced it with a more permanent marker, a small stone with her name carved into it, both Tatami and Little Fawn, along with the words, "She chose the right path." As he stood before the new marker, Mason became aware of another presence nearby. Turning, he found himself face to face with an elderly Comanche man, whose bearing suggested authority despite his age and the civilian clothes he now wore instead of traditional garb. The man's face was deeply lined, his dark eyes reflecting decades of hardship and loss. But there was a dignity in his posture that transcended his circumstances. "Mountain Bear," Mason said quietly, recognizing the former chief from descriptions he had heard. The old man inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. "You are the one," he replied in surprisingly good English. "The one my daughter died to save." It wasn't a question. Mason met his gaze steadily. "She gave me life. I've tried to honor her memory." Mountain Bear was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving from Mason to the stone marker and back again. "My brother wanted your blood," he said finally. "For the death of my son, blood for blood, the old way." He gestured vaguely toward the military buildings of Fort Sill visible in the distance. "Now we live their way. No more blood paths." His voice carried neither bitterness nor acceptance, merely a statement of fact. "Tatami told me about your wife," Mason said carefully, "that she was a white captive, that she taught your daughter to see with clear eyes." At this, a flicker of something, pain perhaps, or remembrance, crossed Mountain Bear's weathered features. "She did not belong in our world. Yet she made a place, like water shaping stone. She changed what she touched." He fell silent again, lost in memory. Then, with effort, he refocused on Mason. "My daughter believed your life worth saving, worth defying her people, her blood." There was a question in his voice, though he didn't articulate it directly. Was she right? Was the white man's life worth her sacrifice? Mason had asked himself the same question countless times over the years. He had no easy answer. but he offered what truth he could. "I can't say if my life was worth her death. No man could, but I've tried to live in a way that honors what she did, to tell her story, to help others see with clear eyes as she did." Mountain Bear considered this, his expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate movements, he reached into a small pouch at his waist and withdrew something that gleamed dully in the afternoon light. He held it out to Mason, a simple silver locket on a tarnished chain. "My wife's," he explained as Mason accepted it hesitantly, "from her before time. She give to Tatami, found with her body." Mason opened the locket carefully. Inside was a tiny portrait of a young white woman with features that suggested a resemblance to Tatame, though the likeness was faded with age. "You should keep this," Mason said, trying to return the precious object. Mountain Bear shook his head. "No, last of my family now walks spirit path. You live because they lived. You keep." Before Mason could respond, the old chief turned and walked away, his figure gradually diminishing against the vast Oklahoma sky. Mason watched until he disappeared from view, the locket clutched tightly in his hand. Then he turned back to Tatam's grave. "I'll keep it safe," he promised softly, "for both of you." Mason Blackwood lived another 20 years after that meeting with Mountain Bear. He never married again, devoting himself instead to his ranch and to his self-appointed role as a bridge between cultures in a rapidly changing West. The frontier that had defined his earlier life gradually disappeared, replaced by settlements, railroads, and the trappings of civilization. The Comanche and other plains tribes, once the undisputed masters of the vast grasslands, were relegated to ever-shrinking reservations, their traditional ways of life increasingly difficult to maintain. Mason watched these changes with a mixture of acceptance and regret, recognizing their inevitability while mourning what was lost in the process. Throughout these years of transition, he kept Tatam's story alive, sharing it with newcomers to the region who had no personal memory of the frontier conflicts. The silver locket given to him by Mountain Bear became his most treasured possession, a tangible reminder of the connection between three lives: the white captive, her Comanche daughter, and the man they had saved in different ways. In the spring of 1896, as he approached his 70th year, Mason fell ill with pneumonia. As his condition worsened, he asked to be moved from his bedroom to the small porch of his ranch house, where he could see the vast Texas sky one last time. A young doctor from the nearest town attended him, more out of respect for the old rancher's wishes than any real hope of recovery. "Not much more I can do for you, Mr. Blackwood," the doctor admitted after examining him. "Would you like me to send for a priest or minister?" Mason shook his head weakly. "No need, but there is something you could do for me." With effort, he reached for the silver locket that hung around his neck, never removed in all the years since Mountain Bear had given it to him. "Take this," he said, pressing it into the surprised doctor's hand, "and the story that goes with it. Promise you'll share both." The young physician, moved by the old man's intensity, nodded solemnly. "I promise, Mr. Blackwood. But what's the story?" With his remaining strength, Mason recounted one final time the tale of his burial in the desert and the extraordinary courage of a Comanche chief's daughter who had defied her tribe to free him. As the sun set on the Texas prairie, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, reminiscent of that long-ago day when he had been rescued, Mason Blackwood closed his eyes for the final time. The young doctor, true to his word, preserved both the locket and the story, eventually donating the former to a small museum in Fort Griffin, where it can still be seen today, accompanied by a simple placard that reads, "Belonging to a Comanche woman called Tatahme, who chose the right path." As for the story itself, it lives on in various forms, sometimes as historical fact, sometimes as frontier legend, but always as a testament to the power of compassion to transcend the deepest divides of culture and prejudice. In the land where such divisions often seemed insurmountable, Tatami's choice stands as a reminder that even in the darkest times, individual acts of mercy can illuminate possibilities invisible to those who see only through the fog of hatred and fear. Her decision to free Mason Blackwood from his desert grave may have cost her life, but the ripples of that single act of courage continue to spread outward through time, touching lives far beyond the sun-baked plains of the Llano Estacado. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.